Well, one of the things that we know here in the United States is that virtually every major institution in the United States is dominated by the hard left. And this is particularly true when it comes to social issues. The momentum that the social left has had for the past several decades is just overwhelming. From corporate America to the government, from the educational system to the entertainment system, pretty much every institution in America is dominated by the left in extraordinary fashion. In this year's greatest indicator is the way that, for example, the Pride Progress flag completely overtook the Pride flag within 1 minute of its proposition during Gay Pride Month, LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign tilde Pride Month. Now remember, there used to be a gay pride flag that was just the rainbow. It was the same rainbow that Barack Obama so unifyingly showed on the White House in the aftermath of Obergefell. Because, of course, if America stands for anything, it is for the proposition that all forms of sexual activity are morally equivalent. But that used to be the flag. The flag was just the rainbow pride flag. Then there was the proposition that it didn't include trans, and it also didn't include BIPOC people or something. And so you have the really, really ugly Pride Progress flag, which from an aesthetic perspective is just hideous. It's got the rainbow flag, but now it has this triangle that comes in from the side. So it looks almost like the Puerto Rican flag, but like with different colors. And it's really not an aesthetically pleasing flag. It was immediately taken over by every major corporation. Everyone started flying the Pride Progress flag within a minute. Right? This thing did not exist 2 years ago, and today it is the only flag that is flown. The gay pride flag is now considered passé. We've moved beyond it. We've moved into a new world. Okay, the momentum with which that shift happened is just demonstrative of how quickly the cultural elites in all of these institutions pick up the most insane, radical arguments of the left and just mainstream them immediately. They don't think about them. They don't consider them. They don't determine whether these arguments are good or not. They just take them and they weaponize them immediately. And nowhere has this been truer than when it comes to radical gender theory and ideology. As I've talked about before, when it comes to LGBTQ plus minus divided by sign, a lot of the arguments in favor of T and Q run directly counter to the arguments for L and G. The arguments for L and G typically were born this way, we were made this way, we can't help our activity, and therefore you should basically leave us alone in the privacy of our own bedrooms, and that's it. And now the argument in favor of T is that there is no such thing as biological essentialism. Men and women do not exist. And also, men and women are not separate categories, which is the predicate for both L and G. Okay, all of these arguments are in conflict with one another. The only way they are not in conflict is if you are directing them at a Judeo-Christian traditional moral superstructure. If you are taking all of these folks and saying, listen, I know you have nothing in common, but we have a coalitional approach to taking down Judeo-Christian morality, and so we are going to band together, despite our differences, in order to tear down that morality, then a lot of this starts to make sense. And a lot of the institutions of American society have bought in. Now, that means that if you are of traditional moral bent, if you're somebody who believes, for example, that natural law suggests that there are better and worse ways on a human level of conducting, for example, your sex life, if you're a person of traditional mores who believes that sex should be defined within marriage between a man and a woman, because sex is not merely about the physical pleasure that you get from sex, it is also about progeneration and creating a new generation of people. And it's about the fulfillment that male and female find in one another when they leave their parents' home and they create a family for themselves. If you believe any of that stuff, then the number of institutions upon which you can rely has been shrinking dramatically. And not only has it been shrinking dramatically, it's been shrinking in almost forceful fashion from the cultural arbiters. If you believe any of this stuff, the idea is that you must be censored. And if you believe even the basic propositions that undergird this stuff, like there are natural differences between men and women, those distinctions are the basis for all mammalian reproduction forever. If you believe that sort of stuff, then you are considered a bigot. Such that when What is a Woman, Matt Walsh's new documentary, which is the #1 streaming documentary in the United States from Daily Wire, it's fantastic, you should watch it. When it comes out, there's a hue and cry from wide elements of the media that we shouldn't be able to advertise this documentary. It hasn't been reviewed by any major reviewer in the United States, despite the fact it is the #1 documentary in the country on any streaming service. Because the idea is it must be silenced. Now, here's the thing. This institutional takeover has real and serious ramifications, because it turns out that when you churn out a bullhorn, and that bullhorn is just promoting propaganda that is anti-biological essentialism, that is churning out anti-natural law, anti-traditional morality, anti-roles, anti-rules, what you get is an enormous number of very confused and emotionally dysfunctional young people. And that's precisely what you're seeing. You're seeing a radical increase in the number of people who are identifying as a member of the quote-unquote non-heterosexual community, the non-exclusively heterosexual community, and it is predominantly in liberal areas. What the polls show is that if you're liberal, Only about 2/3 of people who consider themselves, self-consider liberal, younger Americans, consider themselves exclusively heterosexual today, as opposed to, throughout human history, about 98%. And the reason for that is because so much of this is political. So much of this is about identity and about the belief that traditional structures of humanity are really, really bad, and those have to be torn down. And the more roles and rules that you shun, the more authentic you are in your very own person. And that is the propaganda that is being churned by the left day in, day out, all the time, without a doubt. And you can see proof of this. And Nancy Pelosi, for example, over the weekend, Nancy Pelosi was doing an episode of a Drag Race. So the Speaker of the House of Representatives doing an episode of Drag Race, because drag has now become a mainstream American phenomenon wherein we're all supposed to pretend that there is nothing rule violating, or morally pernicious about men wearing women's clothing and pretending to be women. We're supposed to pretend that doesn't violate any sort of moral strictures. We're supposed to pretend that all of this is essentially morally apathetic. We ought to be morally apathetic toward this stuff. Now, again, I'm not talking about whether we should restrict this stuff by law for adults. That's a different question. I'm talking about whether on a moral level, it is generally good for men to dress like women and women to dress like men. I'm of the belief the answer is no, because men are men and women are women, and the sexual distinction between the two is quite important to a thriving and flourishing society, not a society in hedonistic, narcissistic decline. Okay, but Nancy Pelosi appears on Drag Race, and what she has to say about this is really quite astonishing, because it speaks to what the left believes is the unifying feature of America. Now, traditionally, the unifying feature of America, if you go back to the founding fathers, is the idea that we have liberty from government, but very strong social institutions that undergird that liberty. In the words of John Adams, you need a strong social structure because the Constitution was written, is the wording of John Adams, the Constitution was written for a moral and religious people only. Without that, the passions of the mob would run through the boundaries of the Constitutions like a whale through a net. This has long been the idea of American liberty. American liberty was always undergirded by the idea of American virtue. These two came hand in hand. The notion was that only a virtuous people could be afforded liberty because a non-virtuous people with liberty was going to devolve into libertinism, which is not exactly the same thing. Well, we are there because the way that the left defines liberty is blowing up all the rules. America to them is essentially the proposition that we can regulate every area of your life except when it comes to your self-definition. When it comes to your self-definition, there, we not only have to allow you to do what you want to do on a governmental level, which, is arguable, but we have to cheer it. On a cultural level, we have to cheer it and forward it, and that's what America is really all about. America is about drag queen story hour and Drag Race, according to Nancy Pelosi. It is not about a virtuous people upholding their virtue through the exercise of liberty, particularly at the local level, by building community and by having freedom from government for entrepreneurialism and self-definition in communal terms, that you end up with a better America. No, the idea is that what America really is about is high taxes, gun control, abortion, and drag races. So here's Nancy Pelosi talking about what makes America special.
Give a warm Drag Race welcome to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
These are all men dressed as women. And there's Nancy Pelosi walking out. And everybody's real happy.
My honor to be here to say to all of you how proud we all are of you.
Nothing says
Thank you for the joy and beauty you bring to the world.
Aww.
Your freedom of expression of yourselves in drag is what America is all about.
That is what America's all about. Amazing.
I say that all the time to my friends in drag.
I'm sorry, this is dystopian stuff. It really is. This is what America's all about. We're so proud of you, men, for shirking all of your male societal roles and embracing dressing like women on national television. That is Nancy Pelosi. That is what it's not just a thing that people do and that we ought to tolerate as a society because people act in ways that we don't like, but we don't want government to have enough power to crack down on that stuff because government with too much power can harm all of us. That's not the argument. The argument is this is an active good. You're adding truth and beauty to society by having men appropriate the costumes of women and then pretend to be women for purposes of television ratings. This is what America is all about, says the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And of course, this bleeds down to the local level, to the point where now you have an entire cadre of Americans who believe that it is good to show small children men dressed as women. And not just men dressed as women gyrating sexually in front of small children. So for example, over the last weekend, you had a family-friendly drag queen event in Austin, Texas, which is a contradiction in terms. There's no such thing as a family-friendly drag queen event. There just isn't. I'm sorry, the idea that men and women exist and that these are roles that are important to the flourishing of a society is so that the fact that this even has to be defended in intellectual terms demonstrates that we are a culture that is in a state of complete collapse. There are certain things that people just know, and it's okay to just know them. This is the point that Michael Oakeshott makes about rationalism. And we live in a society where people feel the need to rationalize all of the roles and rules that they've inherited. Well, can I come up within my head why this is important? Now, it's important to try and reason out why a historic institution exists and whether it can be changed. But if the idea is that we are starting tabula rasa and that the burden of proof is on the people in favor of the roles to defend the roles, that the burden of proof is not on you to explain why the roles should be destroyed, then you have completely destroyed society. Because again, society is rooted in all of these fundamental rules and roles. So there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't want my child viewing men who dress up as women and gyrate around on a stage. There's nothing wrong with that. And not even in sexual terms. You can say, listen, I think that boys should dress as boys and girls should dress as girls, and that is an act of good. I believe that's an act of good. Not only do I think there's nothing wrong with that, I think it's quite important because kids need rules. They need boundaries. They need guides. It turns out that civilization is something you have to teach to children. You have to civilize kids. But apparently this is now considered passé. So you have family-friendly drag queen events in places like Austin, Texas. Does this seem family-friendly to you right here? A bunch of men dressed as women dancing around with each other, wearing scanty clothing, grinding their asses against one another. This seems very family-friendly to me, doesn't it? This is family-friendly stuff right here. Really, it's a family-friendly drag queen event. And by the way, if you think that we are not spending money on this sort of stuff, public money on this sort of stuff, you would be wrong. According to the New York Post, over $200,000 is being spent on drag queen shows at New York City schools. So the left, their favorite thing to do, as some of the more nationalist conservatives say, and they're exactly correct on this, what they say is it's not happening and it's good that it is. The argument is, why are you focusing in on all of this stuff? Because it's not happening. And also, it's really good and important that it is, and you should subsidize with your taxpayer dollars. And Nancy Pelosi should talk about how this is the best of America, and so should the president of the United States, Joe Biden. So according to the New York Post, New York is showering taxpayer funds on a group that sends drag queens into city schools, often without parental knowledge or consent, even as parents in other states protest increasingly aggressive efforts to expose kids to gender-bending performers. Last month alone, Drag Story Hour New York City, a nonprofit whose outrageously cross-dressed performers interact with kids as young as 3, earned $46,000 from city contracts for appearances at public schools, street festivals, and libraries, city records show. Since January, the group has organized 49 drag programs in 34 public elementary, middle, and high schools. It boasted on its websites, with appearances in all 5 boroughs. Since 2018, the group has received a total of $207,000 in taxpayer cash. So New York City, where you might be pushed in front of a subway, and also your taxpayer dollars will be used to indoctrinate kids in the joys of gender bending, which of course generally makes people's lives a lot worse. There's a minority of people for whom this is fulfilling and who lead a happier lives because of this, and that is called a minority of people. It's a very vast minority of people throughout human history. Flourishing societies rely. The fact, again, it is beyond insane that I have to explain this to people. A thriving society must have differences between men and women. Those natural differences between men and women are baked in. They're not just baked into the cake with regard to human beings. They're baked into the cake with regard to primates. They're baked into the cake with regard to all mammals. To pretend that societal rules that have evolved over the course of thousands of years are completely arbitrary and specious and made up by the evil patriarchy is to ignore biology. It is to ignore history. It is to ignore how evolution works. It's to ignore everything in favor of a pie in the sky, cloud cuckoo land perception of reality in which you get to throw away all of the institutional pillars of society in favor of these idiotic ideas you have in your head, and then you're shocked when kids are wrecked by this. And you're shocked when you have wildly skyrocketing rates of mental health problems among young children. Why would this happen? Well, because of you. Because you decided that all the guardrails should be removed. And it turns out that basically what childhood is sliding down a very curvy mountainside in the rain in a car that doesn't have any sort of tread on the wheels. And what you as a parent are supposed to do is you are supposed to line up in front of your child so that that slide down the mountain into adulthood is slow. And you're also supposed to make sure beforehand that there are guardrails around the road so the kid doesn't fall off. We've removed all the guardrails, and then we have said that any adult that is in front of the kid to prevent that car from just skidding right off the road is now an impediment to that child's self-fulfillment. So as that child flies through the air off the road, we're supposed to pretend that look, the kid's flying. No, the kid's falling. The kid's falling because of you. How's this for a title? Ben Shapiro Show subscriber destroys like button with clicks and logic. I'd watch that. Make it happen, gang.